What if I told you the most feared men in Vietnam weren't American, and weren't even Vietnamese, but a handful of Australians who learned how to turn the jungle into a weapon? Not with bombs, not with artillery, not with body counts stacked high for headquarters, with silence. So complete, it made hardened fighters swear the forest was haunted. For decades, the stories stayed where they belonged, in sealed debriefs, in whispered barroom confessions, in the tight mouths of men who refused to talk. But one American did talk, not publicly, not proudly, not in the way veterans usually do when they want to be understood. He talked the way a man talks when he's trying to convince a psychiatrist that he isn't losing his mind. Because what he witnessed didn't look like war, it looked like hunting. And when you watch other humans get hunted, quietly, patiently, professionally, something changes in you. This is a fictionalized reconstruction, inspired by the kinds of rumors that never die, about an American Green Beret who volunteered for 11 nights with the Australian SAS. His name in the record is Staff Sergeant Daniel Keane. And the moment the jungle went dark beside them, Keane realized the Australians weren't operating in the same reality. The Viet Cong had a name for men like this: Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and they weren't exaggerating. The first warning came as a handshake. Australian Task Force Headquarters, Nui Dat. March, heat hanging over the sandbags like a wet blanket. Keane expected professionalism, the polite allied rhythm of paperwork and briefings. Instead, a man stepped out of the shade like he'd been carved from it. Warrant Officer Class 2, Liam Wombat Carver, 3 Squadron SASR. Not tall, not imposing. Sun-bleached hair, eyes too calm. The kind of calm you only see in men who've already decided how they'll survive you. Carver looked Keane over without hiding it, like a tradesman inspecting a tool that might break in his hands. "You're the volunteer," Carver said. Keane tried to smile. "That's me." Carver's mouth twitched. Not warmth, not humor, a quiet amusement. 11 nights, Carver said. "That's the plan. Most visitors don't make it to 3. Keane bristled. "Green Berets don't quit." Carver nodded as if Keane had said something adorable. "Good," he replied. "Then you won't mind doing everything wrong until you learn to do it right." Keane didn't understand the sentence yet. He would. The second warning came on the packing floor. Keane arrived with American logic in his rucksack. C rations, extra ammo, spare batteries, poncho liner, radio gear, smoke, flares, a little civilization stuffed into canvas. 3 days of reconnaissance, maybe 4. Then extraction. That was the rhythm. Even in the jungle, Americans carried the idea that a helicopter was only a call away. The Australians laid their kit out on the boards like men who had already accepted they might not be found if something went wrong. Rice, dried fish, a few tea bags, water purification, a small amount of ammunition, knives that looked used enough to have stories, no spare comfort, no extras. Keane stared. "That's it?" Carver didn't look up. "That's it." Keane pointed at the radios. "You're not bringing comms?" Carver finally met his eyes. For the first week, no. Keane laughed once, because it sounded like a joke. It wasn't. "How do you call for fire support?" Keane asked. Carver shrugged. "We don't." "How do you call for extraction?" Carver's shrug was smaller this time. "We don't plan on needing it." Keane felt irritation rising. "This is reckless." Carver held up a finger, like a teacher pausing a child. "This," he said, tapping Keane's heavy rucksack, "is American. It assumes noise is acceptable. It assumes the jungle is a place you pass through until the helicopters come." Then Carver tapped his own lighter pack. "This assumes the jungle is listening." Keane didn't answer. Carver leaned closer. "And the jungle always listens." They stepped off at 1700 hours, into that hour where the light starts to bleed out of the trees. Keane expected formation: point man, slack, team leader, rear security, measured intervals, clear chain of movement. Instead, the SAS moved like spilled water. Sometimes close enough to brush shoulders, sometimes scattered so wide Keane thought he'd been abandoned. No talking, no whispered corrections, no metallic clicks, just motion. He tried to keep them in sight. He failed within 20 minutes. The jungle swallowed them with the casual indifference of something ancient that had eaten better men. Keane felt panic rise in his throat. Not fear of the enemy exactly, but fear of being alone in a place where the darkness had weight. Then a hand touched his shoulder. Keane nearly shouted. A face appeared inches from his, Carver's face, materializing out of nothing. Not creeping, not crawling, not snapping twigs or brushing leaves, just there. Carver held a finger to his lips. Then he pointed down. Keane looked. A faint line of compressed leaf litter. Not a trail, not really. A suggestion. Carver put his boot down, and Keane saw it. The boot didn't crush the leaves. It settled into the ground like it had always belonged there. Carver motioned Keane forward. "Step exactly where I step." Keane tried. His first step cracked a twig. Carver didn't glare. He didn't sigh. He didn't look annoyed. He simply reached down, picked up the broken twig, and set it back in place like he was repairing evidence at a crime scene. Then he looked at Keane and whispered, "You just told the jungle you're here." And Keane, for the first time, felt ashamed. That night, Keane learned the Australians had a different definition of rest. They didn't set up a perimeter like Americans. No obvious security, no whispered watch rotations. They dissolved. One man sat with his back against a root flare, eyes half-lidded, breathing slow. Another lay on his side like a fallen branch. Another squatted in a shadow so still Keen couldn't tell if he was awake. Keen checked his watch. One operator, young, freckles, the casual face of a beach lifeguard, didn't move for 4 hours. Keen timed it, convinced he'd drifted off. Then far away, a gecko rustled a leaf. The operator's head turned, not sharply, not dramatically, just a fraction, as if his skull rotated on oiled bearings. Then he returned to stillness, awake, alert, inhumanly quiet. Keen felt a cold bloom of realization. American training taught stealth like a skill. The Australians wore it like a skin. On the third night, they found a Viet Cong cache. It was hidden beneath nothing, a patch of earth that looked identical to the 1,000 others around it. One SAS trooper, Collins, the ex-surfer, stopped and stared at the ground like he'd heard it speak. He crouched, brushed aside leaves, and revealed a seam so subtle Keen would have missed it even if he'd been told to look. Underneath, rice sacks, ammo tins, medical supplies, a small fortune in jungle war. Keen expected the radio, expected coordinates, expected air support to turn it into a crater. Carver didn't even touch the explosives. He simply watched, counted, memorized. Then he smiled that small, empty smile. "We wait," he whispered. Keen frowned. "For what?" Carver's voice was barely sound. "For the man who thinks he owns it." Keen didn't like the sentence. It sounded personal. The waiting was the lesson. The Australians didn't treat the cache as a target. They treated it as bait. Keen lay in the wet darkness listening to insects scrape the air, to his own blood moving in his ears, and realized the SAS had turned the jungle into a trap that didn't snap. It simply closed. On the 5th morning, just before dawn, a courier arrived. Young, thin, confident. He approached like a man who believed in invisibility because he'd never been punished for believing it. Keen expected capture, interrogation, or a quick silent kill. Instead, 2 Australians flowed out behind him like they'd been sewn to his shadow. They didn't touch him. They borrowed him. For 6 hours, the courier walked and the SAS walked with him without him ever knowing. They passed within meters of other fighters. They crossed little trails Keen couldn't see. They paused when the courier paused, so precisely it felt synchronized. And Keen understood something terrifying. These Australians could have been behind him every day of his Vietnam tour and he would never have known. By midday, the courier reached a concealed camp. The SAS didn't attack. They watched. They counted men. They marked patterns. They learned who left and who returned. They gathered intelligence the way a predator learns a herd, not by charging, but by understanding the rhythm of movement until the kill becomes inevitable. When they finally withdrew, Keen's notebook contained more useful detail than weeks of American sweeps. No gunshots, no radio calls, just knowledge. And the Australians weren't satisfied. Carver's whisper came as they moved away. "Now we teach them fear." On the 7th night, they executed what the SAS called a ghost cut. They approached the camp through jungle so dense movement was measured in breaths. They stopped at the perimeter and watched for hours. Keen expected impatience. Instead, the Australians watched like men listening to a song only they could hear. Sentries paced, a lantern bobbed, a cough, a quiet joke in Vietnamese. To Keen's American instincts, the perimeter looked solid enough. To the Australians, it was full of holes. Not holes in space, holes in time. A sentry turned his head for 2 seconds to spit. A patrol stepped around a tree and left a gap behind it for a heartbeat. A lantern swung, creating a moment of blindness. Carver pointed once, twice, tiny motions. Then the Australians moved. 5 shadows detached from the darkness and slid through the perimeter like smoke through mesh. Keen watched, frozen, as an enemy position filled with armed men failed to notice the breach. No gunfire, no shouting, not even the sharp animal snap of a startled branch. Just absence. Minutes stretched. Keen's hands were sweating so badly his rifle felt slick. Then, very softly, a signal. Carver's hand touched Keen's sleeve. They withdrew, and Keen realized something that made his stomach drop. The Australians hadn't gone in to fight, they'd gone in to edit reality. At first light, Keen saw the aftermath through binoculars. The camp still stood, no crater, no smoke column. But something had happened. Men clustered in tight groups, speaking fast. Sentries looked over their shoulders like hunted animals. A fighter sprinted from one hut carrying something wrapped in cloth and dropped it like it was burning him. Then Keen saw the detail that made his throat tighten. Boots. A line of boots neatly arranged at the edge of camp, not piled, not discarded, placed. To Keen's eyes, it was weird. To Vietnamese eyes, it was a message, a quiet suggestion that the dead were walking, that something had entered the camp without being seen and could do it again. Then another thing. Personal items, small shrines, charms, family tokens, moved. Not stolen, rearranged, placed in patterns that felt deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where to press to trigger an old fear. A man stumbled out of a hut with his face the color of wet ash. He shouted something. Others looked, and then the camp began to break apart. Not tactically, not in retreat formation, in panic, weapons left behind, food abandoned, ammunition spilled into the dirt. They ran into the jungle from something they couldn't name. Keen watched and understood the Australians had achieved what American firepower rarely could. They didn't just remove enemy bodies, they removed enemy belief. Belief that the jungle protected them, belief that sentries mattered, belief that fighting made sense. Carver watched beside him, calm. Keen whispered, "You didn't even shoot." Carver's reply was barely audible. "Why waste bullets," he said, "when fear travels farther? Later, during the slow pull back toward extraction, Keen saw the other half of the secret. An older man traveled with them, quiet as the rest, but different. His movements weren't trained the way the soldiers were. They were natural. They called him Jonah, but Keen learned that wasn't his real name. An Aboriginal tracker, on loan, unofficial, the kind of arrangement that never shows up in clean paperwork. Jonah stopped at a patch of ground Keen would have walked over. He crouched, touched a leaf, and sniffed the air like a dog. Then he held up 3 fingers. Carver nodded. 3 men had passed, not long ago, carrying weight, tired. Keen stared. How can you tell? Jonah didn't even look up. The insects are wrong, he murmured. The ants are rebuilding. Keen felt his skin prickle. It was like watching someone read a book written in a language you didn't know existed. Collins, surfer, lifeguard, now hunter, watched Jonah with the hunger of a student. This was the pipeline. This was how Beach Boys became ghosts. Not by learning to shoot better, by learning to see better, by learning to move as if the jungle was their first home, not an enemy environment. And when you learn that, you stop being a soldier who visits the dark. You become something the dark recognizes. Keen lasted 11 nights. On the 12th day, when they finally reached the extraction point, Keen requested to be pulled immediately. The request, according to the version of the story that survives, was denied for hours. He sat under the trees, shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that the jungle had new rules now, rules he couldn't unlearn. Back at headquarters, Keen's debrief was short on firefights and long on something worse. Descriptions of silence, of movement, of men who could watch without blinking until watching became a weapon. A psychiatrist later wrote that Keen didn't report combat trauma in the normal way. He didn't jump at loud noises. He jumped at quiet ones. He didn't have nightmares of explosions. He had nightmares of hearing nothing and realizing that nothing was approaching. Keen went home after Vietnam, but Vietnam didn't leave him. He stopped sleeping in beds. A bed meant someone could approach from behind. He slept in a chair facing the door with a heavy object, then a pistol within reach. He removed nightlights from the house. False light, he muttered. It makes you blind. His wife tried at first. Then she started watching him the way you watch a storm approaching. Their children learned quickly not to run down hallways at night. Keen taught them, without explaining why, how to place their feet quietly, how to pause before entering a room, how to listen for the house breathing. His marriage cracked, then collapsed. In court, his wife said something simple that carried the full weight of what happened to him. He came back, and it was like he never stopped being hunted. Keen's career ended the way some do, not with a medal ceremony, but with paperwork and silence and a door closing softly. His psychiatric file was marked sensitive. Then years later, so the story goes, there was an unusual request through diplomatic channels. Australian officials had become aware that details of SAS methods were appearing in Keen's therapy notes. They asked that those sections be sealed, not destroyed, not denied, just buried deeper, because the most disturbing implication wasn't what Keen saw in 1968 or 1969. It was that the Australians were still teaching it. Somewhere in some training area you'll never visit, young men were still learning how to become the kind of quiet that makes other men run. People argue about stories like this. They say it's exaggeration. They say war grows myths like mold. They say veterans misremember, maybe, but myths don't usually have the same shape in the mouths of strangers. And for decades, across different units, different nations, one theme kept returning. The Australians moved differently, waited longer, fought less, won more, not by being louder, by being invisible. If American doctrine was a hammer, Australian doctrine was a blade, and Daniel Keen, Green Beret, hardened, trained, didn't break because he saw violence. He broke because he saw how cleanly violence could be done when you stopped pretending war was a contest and admitted it was predation. That knowledge sits in a person like a splinter you can't pull out. It changes how you walk through woods, how you enter rooms, how you listen to silence. Because once you've watched a human being move through darkness like a ghost, you never fully believe in safety again. And that's the final twist in the story of the night hunters. The jungle didn't just swallow light, it swallowed certainty. It taught a handful of men how to erase themselves, and it taught one American observer that the line between soldier and predator isn't a training manual, it's a choice. Some men choose to keep their humanity intact and accept the cost in blood and chaos. Other men choose to become something older, something that doesn't need radios, doesn't need air support, doesn't need permission, something that waits in the tree line until you're tired, distracted, certain you're alone. And then, without a sound, it moves. Night 8 began with rain so heavy it sounded like applause, the kind of jungle rain that doesn't fall. It arrives like a curtain slammed shut. Keen thought stupidly that the downpour would make them safer. Noise covers noise, right? But Carver shook his head as if Keen had suggested lighting a cigarette. Rain tells stories, Carver whispered. It shows what doesn't belong. Keen didn't understand until he watched Jonah, the tracker, tilt his face into the rain and listen. Not with his ears exactly, with his whole body. Jonah pointed at a cluster of broad leaves trembling wrong. The rain hit everything hard, but that patch shivered like something had passed beneath it minutes ago. Collins crouched, touched the mud, rubbed it between finger and thumb. Fresh, he murmured. Keen stared at the ground. He saw nothing. Then Jonah glanced at him. Not unkindly, but with the patient pity you give a man who can't read. In your country, Jonah said quietly, men walk on land. Here, the land walks back. They followed the sign for an hour without saying a word, and Keen began to notice something worse than silence. How the Australians trusted it. They weren't tense in the dark. They weren't forcing themselves through fear. They moved like the night belonged to them the way daylight belongs to farmers. It wasn't bravery, it was familiarity, and that terrified him more than bullets ever had. That evening, they set a listening hide not to watch the enemy, but to watch the jungle behave. Carver chose a spot that looked like nothing. No high ground, no clear lines of sight, just a thick tangle of root and vine that felt claustrophobic. Keen wanted to ask, why here? But Carver didn't answer questions out loud. He showed the answer. He reached into his kit and pulled out something small, a strip of cloth. He tied it, loose, around a thin sapling. Then he waited. Minutes passed. The sapling moved in the rain wind like all saplings do. Then, once, it twitched against the cloth in a way the wind couldn't explain. Carver's eyes sharpened. Keen felt his heartbeat start to bang in his throat. Nothing happened, no figure emerged, no muzzle flash, just a twitch, and Keen realized the strip of cloth wasn't a signal. It was a lie detector, a way to measure the invisible. Carver leaned toward Keen's ear. Most men think stealth means not being heard, he whispered. He pointed into the black. It means not being felt. Later that night, Keen finally heard the enemy up close, not in a firefight, in the way soldiers sound when they think they're safe. 2 Viet Cong scouts passed nearby, close enough Keen could smell the sour sweat under their uniforms. They spoke softly, complaining, laughing once. They paused. One lit something, not a cigarette, a tiny ember cupped in a hand to keep it hidden. The glow was so small it barely existed, but in the jungle, even a pinprick of light is a flare. Keen held his breath. Carver didn't move. Collins didn't move. Jonah didn't move. The scouts stood there for a full minute, heads turning slowly. Keen was certain they'd spotted them. Then one scout laughed again, spat, and the pair moved on. When the footsteps faded, Keen released air like he'd been underwater. He whispered, "We could have taken them." Carver's response was immediate, cold, almost bored. "Could have," he said. Then he added quieter, "Why feed the jungle?" Keen frowned. "What does that mean?" Carver's eyes stayed on the darkness. "Every time you kill," he murmured, "the jungle changes. Insects gather, birds go quiet, men search. We're not here to make noise. We're here to make them doubt." Keen swallowed. Doubt as a weapon. That concept wasn't in any American manual he'd ever studied. Night 9 was the night Keen started to change. Not the big dramatic way, no speech, no breakdown, just small betrayals of instinct. He found himself copying their pauses, their timing. He stopped stepping over vines and started stepping around them. He caught himself holding his breath during moments of movement as if breath had a sound. At one point, he realized he'd been walking for 20 minutes without blinking, and the worst part, it felt efficient, like he'd been wasting energy his whole life. They found a small enemy rest spot, not a camp, more like a temporary shelter, a tarp, a cooking ring, a few scattered personal items. The Australians didn't loot. They didn't burn it. They didn't touch anything the way Americans did when they wanted to leave a message. They did something stranger. Carver knelt and moved one object exactly the width of a thumb, a small charm hanging from a cord. Collins adjusted the cord so it rested at a slightly different angle. Jonah picked up a spoon and set it down, handle facing the opposite direction. Keen watched, confused. "What are we doing?" he whispered. Carver didn't look up. "We're writing." "Writing what?" Carver finally met his eyes. "A story they'll tell themselves." Keen wanted to argue that a thumb's width didn't matter. Then Collins whispered, "Superstition is just pattern recognition without permission." Keen felt a chill, because he understood the play now. Not destruction, violation. The sense that something entered your space and moved your world without you seeing it. They left. And Keen couldn't stop imagining the first fighter returning, noticing, without knowing why, that something was wrong. A charm hanging wrong. A spoon pointing wrong. The mind does the rest. If the charm moved and no one touched it, what else is moving? Night 10 was the closest Keen came to dying, not because of a firefight, because of a single mistake. They were shadowing a patrol route, tracking a small group moving between caches. No radios, no fire support, just feet and patience. They reached a shallow river cutting through the jungle like a strip of darker sky. Water makes noise, it also steals it. Footsteps disappear, whispers blur. Keen thought water would help. Carver signaled a slow crossing, one at a time, spacing, timing. Keen stepped into the river. Cold shut up his legs. He moved carefully, placing his feet the way Carver had shown him. Then his boot struck something underwater. A stone, a log, he didn't know. His foot slipped. His rifle bumped the surface. A tiny splash. Small. But in that moment, it felt like a grenade. Carver's head turned instantly. Not angry, alert. The entire patrol froze. Keen's lungs locked. On the far bank, a Viet Cong sentry, not even part of the group they were tracking, stood up in the shadows. He was close. Too close. Keen saw the outline of a weapon. The sentry leaned forward, listening. Keen's mouth went dry. He expected Carver to fire. Instead, Carver did something that made Keen's brain stall. He became a sound. Carver made a small, precise noise from deeper in the jungle. Not a shout, not a whistle. A bird call. Perfectly wrong in its perfection. The sentry hesitated. His head turned toward the call, and in that half second of attention shift, Collins moved. Keen did not see him cross the distance. He only saw the result. The sentry's posture changed like a puppet whose strings were cut. No scream, no struggle, just absence. Collins eased the body down as gently as setting a sleeping child into bed. Keen stood in the river shaking with adrenaline. Carver's eyes met his, not accusing, not forgiving, just stating devastating fact. Noise is debt, Carver whispered. You pay it, or you die owing. Keen nodded because there was nothing else to do, but inside him, something cracked. He realized he'd almost died not in combat, but in etiquette, the etiquette of the dark. Night 11 was the final lesson. It began with a decision Keen wasn't invited to vote on. Carver gathered them in a tight hide just after dusk. No briefing like Americans did, no map spread, no mission slide, just Carver's hand motions, Jonah's quiet nods, Collins's eyes bright with focus. They were going back to the headquarters camp they'd marked earlier, but not for another ghost cut, for something more personal. Keen whispered, "We're hitting it?" Carver's eyes stayed level. "We're touching it," he murmured. "Touching what?" Carver paused. Then, in the barest breath, he said, "The head." Keen's stomach sank. Leadership. A man. A name. A face. This wasn't a morale trick anymore. This was removal. They moved for hours. Keen lost all sense of distance and time. The jungle compressed reality until the entire world was a 10-foot circle of darkness around his body. When they reached the perimeter, Keen's heart began to pound again. He expected the same clean entry, but tonight the camp felt different, more awake, more suspicious. A lantern moved with purpose. Sentries clustered closer. The enemy had learned something, or at least suspected. The jungle ghosts had visited, and now the camp was watching the dark the way a hunted animal watches tall grass. Carver studied it. Stillness. Then he signaled. They waited. An hour passed. 2. Keen's muscles screamed from holding still. His mind tried to fill the silence with thoughts. What if they see us? What if they're baiting us? What if this is the night we finally get caught? Carver didn't blink. Jonah's breathing stayed slow. Collins looked like a man listening to a melody only he could hear. And then, the moment arrived. A sentry stepped away to relieve himself behind a tree. The lantern swung. A gap opened. Not in space. In time. Carver's fingers moved. Now. They flowed through. Keen followed because his body obeyed before his mind could argue. Inside the camp, everything smelled human. Smoke, sweat, rice, damp cloth. Keen felt like a burglar inside a stranger's home. He saw sleeping shapes. He saw a man awake chewing something, eyes unfocused. He wanted to shout to wake them all just to end the tension. But the SAS were already past him. Carver pointed Keen to a spot behind a low structure. Stay, watch, do not move. Keen crouched, weapon ready, eyes burning from not blinking. He watched Carver and Collins slip toward a larger hut. They disappeared behind it. Minutes crawled. Keen heard nothing. Then he heard a single sound that made his blood freeze. A soft, startled intake of breath from inside the hut. Not a scream. A realization. A man waking up and understanding instantly that something impossible was happening. Then silence again. Carver reappeared like he'd been there the whole time. Collins followed, hands empty, expression unchanged. Jonah moved ahead, guiding, and then Keen saw it. Between them, a figure. Not dragged, not carried over the shoulder, moved upright, supported, almost gently, as if they were escorting a drunk friend home. A prisoner. Alive. Eyes wide, mouth gagged, body rigid with terror. Keen's mind rebelled. How do you pull a man out of the center of his own camp without the camp waking up? Carver's eyes flicked to Keen. No pride, no triumph, just the quiet certainty of a craftsman finishing a job. They slipped out the same way they entered, and behind them, the camp remained sleeping, not because it was safe, because it never knew it had been robbed. They moved hard for hours after that. No pauses, no lessons, just travel. At dawn, in a hidden draw, they stopped. Carver watched the prisoner as if studying an animal. The man's eyes darted. He was breathing fast through his nose. Keen expected interrogation, expected force. Carver didn't do any of that. He crouched, leaned close, and spoke softly in Vietnamese. Keen understood none of the words, but he understood the effect. The prisoner's eyes changed. Confusion first, then fear, then a deeper fear. The kind that doesn't come from threats, but from implications. Any night, if they wanted. That's why the file was sealed. That's why the debriefs were buried. Not because the Australians were monsters, but because their methods made everyone else look like amateurs. Because if you admit your closest ally fought smarter, quieter, cleaner, you also have to admit that the line between soldier and predator is thinner than anyone wants to believe. And Daniel Keen spent the rest of his life living in that thin space. Not broken by gore, broken by a truth so simple it sounded like a ghost story. In the jungle, the loudest force isn't always the deadliest. Sometimes the deadliest thing is the man you never heard, the one who doesn't fight you, the one who waits for the perfect gap in time, the one who moves when your mind is certain the darkness is empty. Because the darkness was never empty, it was just trained, and once you've seen that, you never sleep the same way again.